That's why you get 60%.
I mean, one of the one that's open.
Like the way it was set up before.
We'll only need
I haven't seen this color.
Yeah. Let me go get
She knew exactly what she was doing.
Yeah, I created this one, the other one, and being of the generation we were, we all have to
Thank you so much I think
very much it can just be an arrow or whatever. Just be like a big arrow.
Yeah, we have to do it for us.
we have to
Hi, everyone.
stand.
We're going to get started in a minute. If you can take seats, please. If you can take seats, please, we're going to get started in a few minutes. If you search YouTube, are you on YouTube? So if you search Faith in Design, GSD, it should come
We
up.
also shared it on the are we gonna huddle around this mic?
We can just step back and forth.
Really?
Cha-cha.
Okay.
What?
We can just stand like
What?
close to it.
You have to, yeah, we have to be good role models for our panelists.
Oh my god. Okay, fine. We have to see. Do you need this clicker?
No, just put this up.
I guess we could share one.
That's fine.
I'm going to leave you, but really,
Okay.
congratulations to both of you. Everyone is so positive about what you've both done and the kind of great people that you've got together. And I haven't seen Paula. I didn't realize that she's left Yale and now she's somewhere in New Mexico.
Yeah,
Incredible things. And Patrick Quinn. You got good people together. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So ready to start? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
we're about to start.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Have fun in China.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Shall I start?
Yeah.
Welcome to Faith in Design and the Harvard Graduate School of Design if you're not already here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Chantine, this is Ben, and we are both fourth year Master of Architecture students and the co-chairs of this conference.
Before we get started, some major thank yous are in order. First, thank you to our team of student organizers, Carolyn Craddock, Hannah Kim, Nabila Mahdi, Sydney Pedigo, and Ethan Poe. Thank you also to Jeff Barneson and Rabbi Getzel Davis, our advisors. And thank you also to Erica George, who's in the Student Services Office.
And we must also, we must also thank our sponsors for today's conference, Christian Union, the GSD Dean's Office, and Mosim Mostavi, GSD Student Services, and Laura Snowden, Harvard Hillel Graduate Community, and InterVarsity. Thanks also to all of our panelists who are here with us.
So why are we having this conference? As Chantine mentioned, this is our fourth year here at the GSD. And over that time, we've had a number of conversations about how we bring our personal backgrounds into our design work. I'm Jewish, Chantine is Christian, and for a lot of people, including the two of us, our personal background is shaped by our religion, spirituality, faith, identity, culture, ethnicity, etc. And yet, modern architecture school pedagogy ignores all of those and focuses on a specific set of terms or ideas instead.
We started having these conversations informally, but over the years, we realized that it wasn't just us thinking about these things. We realized that other people, including a lot of the people in this room right now, were also coming across these questions. As future practitioners, we realized our education has prepared us to be designers, but has not fully prepared us to reconcile the two identities that we have, our religious identity and our design one.
The point of today's conference is to continue these conversations and hear from a variety of people across the professional and academic worlds and from a variety of faith backgrounds, and give us more perspective and help others who may be having these questions as well to start to find answers to them. Maybe it'll also help us stumble towards understanding the worlds that we live in.
We fully acknowledge that today's conference doesn't include everyone. We are mainly going to be hearing from the people of the three Abrahamic religions, but we hope that this is not an exclusive conversation. We hope that this is the first of many events to connect Jews, Christians, and Muslims in design with a broader world. Hopefully, that will include a wider set of voices in the future. But we are interested in this conference being about people of religions who are also working in the fields of design.
We should also say that all of the terms used today are quite messy. As we've been planning, we have continued to come across words that are used differently by different groups, religions, or even generations. We've asked Christina Gonzalez Ho to offer some closing remarks today, and we're hopeful that she will be able to point us towards tools to keep the language inclusive and definitions to keep the conversation moving forward.
Let's quickly review the structure for today. Since we are good GSD students, we will begin with the historical and theoretical frameworks of religion and design. The second panel will deal with issues within the practice of design as people of faith, and the last panel will talk about issues related to our environment and how we can create a better world, better work, and better spiritual lives for ourselves and for those around us.
As organizers of the conference, we're interested in big picture ideas and hope the panelists will speak to some of them. We're also interested in the practicals of being an architect and attending church, being a planner and not working on Sabbath, or being a designer observing Ramadan. And we are interested in our panelists helping us to explore what we can bring to the table as designers of faith, as practitioners, or as academics.
As a coalition of students at the GSD, this conference is specifically being held here because we want to bring attention to the lack of explicit representation of designers of faith within the field and within the school. We are here, we are proud to be here, and we are so thankful that all of you are here as well.
Some quick logistics. We wanted this conference to be dynamic and conversational, so each panelist will present for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then the panel will join together for 45 minutes or so of conversation up at the front, hopefully with audience member participation as well. This is currently being live streamed to YouTube and will be available after, so for panelists and question askers, please use a microphone, either this one or the handhelds, even if you can project your voice. It's not just for the people in the room. Lunch is going to be held in room 123, which is down the hall following the first panel. And then between panels 2 and 3, there will be a snack break. Following the third panel, we're going to have our own happy hour, but then we'll join with the rest of the GSD for the weekly Beer and Dogs event. And we also have a limited number of spots remaining if you are interested in joining our committee for a free Shabbat dinner this evening hosted at Harvard Hillel. If you are, we just ask that you sign up before 1 o'clock today. We couldn't include everyone's bios in full in the programs, but you can find more information on our website, faithanddesign.co. And also follow our Instagram.
So let's begin. Our first panelists are Christian Gonzalez Ho. He's a cultural theorist, writer, consultant, and a well-loved graduate of the GSD. He was a big influence on shaping what our Christian Fellowship is today. Oludamini Ogunnaike is an assistant professor of religious studies at the College of William and Mary, where he teaches courses on Islam, Islamic philosophy, spirituality, and art, as well as African and African diasporic religions. He received his BA and PhD from Harvard. Ed Eigen is a senior lecturer in the history of landscape and architecture here at the GSD and is also a curator for the exhibition Outside on Mountains. And our moderator will be Barbara Mann, who is the Kana Kext professor of Jewish literature at the Jewish Theological Seminary and whose interest is in places and spaces. Again, thank you all so much for being here, and please welcome Christian Gonzalez Ho.
All right. This is cool. I never got to stand up here. I was always sitting in front of it. Okay, I want to start with an artist that we befriended. My wife, Christina Gonzalez Ho, and I wrote a book on the contemporary art world in Los Angeles. And so we interviewed about over 100. We talked to and interviewed over 100 artists, gallerists, directors, to kind of find out what is the contemporary art world in LA, what makes it unique, and its features historically. But we were also interested in what is its relationship to faith and spirituality. Really simple project. Did it in a year. I'm sure we covered everything. But the conversations that happened out of it were really profound, really incredible things. And I think it informs a lot of what I'm going to say today, because in our discussions with Paul Ruchet, Lita Albuquerque, people whose work sells for over $1 million, to people just in graduate school, one of the most common things that would happen in interviews that would wind up spanning 3 hours, sometimes more, was that they'd never shared publicly like their feelings and ideas about faith and spirituality. And it was a really fascinating thing, because art is, there's a kind of perception that art really is grappling with the things of the soul. So this is a work by Nathaniel Mary Quinn, and it is kind of what I want to name this talk. It's called "It Was All a Dream." Now, Nathaniel was talking to us about his process, and what his process is he receives very distinct and clear, detailed visions. And from those visions, they'll remain with him, and he will pour through stacks and stacks of images and go through Google magazines, etc. And then he will collage these images. They don't feel right. If they don't have a fidelity to his vision, he's not gonna finish the work, so to speak. However, the process by which Nathaniel produces his work remains totally invisible in the artistic discourse. Nathaniel Mary Quinn is a rising star in the art world. Elton John, the largest art collector in the United States, has a good number of his works, but the critical discourse around it is that it engages with and right.
Some of us trifle hard here.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Sorry. So much of his work does deal with social theory. It does deal with, and it is dealing with identity, origins. However, the way his work arises is from this deeply spiritual phenomenon, but it's not discussed. And I wanted to go to a recent book that's come out called No Idols by Thomas Crow, kind of talks about this. And he says, art is probably the last remnant of magic we have left because we've jettisoned most of the magical beliefs that used to guide human behavior or perceptions of the world. But in getting rid of all those things, we also got rid of a dimension of what I would call a connection to the unknown. It's to see beyond the immediate objects or fetishes that we put in our way and sometimes make to stand for something that in fact is incommensurably greater than anything we can contain or hold in our perception. So I want to explore this a little bit because although on the surface and in academia there is this absence, in practice, and as we just discussed with Nathaniel, and as Thomas Crow's book looks at Robert Smithson, Mark Rothko, and many other modern artists who specifically wrote about their spiritual, the integration of the supernatural and their spiritual beliefs within the creation of their artwork. So I want to look at a few figures that kind of display this other way of processing, and then even their own experiences. So we interviewed Lita Albuquerque. Her work is known as a landscape artist. She's really interested in the relationship of the body. So the microcosm of the body to the macrocosm of the cosmos. Her works have been in Giza, among the pyramids, in Antarctica, and stretching across various landscapes. And when we were talking to her, she said, you can't critique, but why is it so difficult to have a conversation that incorporates a discussion about the supernatural, in which there seems to not have developed a discourse? And she says, art students are taught to pull from an overwhelmingly secular canon of Western art history, theory, and critique when discussing art. You can't critique somebody's personal experience. It's not based on a shared cultural value. But unless those ideas have been conceptualized and theorized, and therefore can be critiqued as meaningful as an individual's experience may be, it cannot be taught or discussed until it becomes part of a theory. Another example of this in the architecture world, for me, has always been John Heydrich. And in an interview with David Shapiro, Heydrich talking about architecture said, I think the only thing that the architect can offer our society is the creation of a spirit. I mean, some kind of aura. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, slow down because then we cannot absorb.
Okay. Something eternal in a sense that, strangely enough, has been lost. Architecture has to do with sound, but not with pragmatic sound, but with a supernatural sound, a sound of the soul. When you enter a building, it gives you the wavelength of its sound. It is something that characterizes the best architecture of all times. One can be a good builder. There are people who make good buildings today, but the architect's task is to capture that atmosphere, sound. And the example he gives is actually Corbusier's Carpenter Center, which is right across the block. This interests me because Heydrich really, although most of his projects aren't built, he's really grappling with, and especially later on in his life, and exploring the supernatural and its manifestation in architecture, and using the architectural mode of representation and its phenomenon as a way of engaging with mystery, which is what I would argue has been the case for architecture for some time now. This is another one of his pieces. And, you know, I would pull this all the way back. I just wanted to give some context that architecture has been the native mode of engagement with the supernatural and a platform for meditation, worship, and devotion for most of human history, dating back to the Lascaux caves in France. So these are dated at about like 17,000 years old, or sorry, 17,000 BC. And they're known to be these sites of worship. They're one of the first recorded sites of art that we have. And yet somehow, and as you look at the span of art history, the creation of spaces and the expression of work is consistently aligned with devotion, acts of devotion to the supernatural, or a platform for engagement with the supernatural. And yet somehow, curiously enough, within the last few centuries and explicitly within the last 100 years, boundary lines have been redrawn in the Western world so that the language of faith is understood to be incongruous within the context of contemporary discourse within art and architecture. So my interest is, what is the epistemic context that allowed them to be understood as separate entities, despite the fact that they are not so separate in history? Our devotional practices and rituals may have transformed, but the phenomenon of worship and devotion within Western culture has simply shifted and expanded. So they have gone from the gods to Christianity, to the state, to science, to capital, to technology. What we see right now is clearly a field of belief. It's not a way of belief. And then you see that really specifically with Walter Gropius. I was just looking across the way, and he says, "Together, let us desire, conceive, create the new structure of the future, which will embrace architecture and sculpture and painting in one unity." So there's clearly an understanding that the foundation of faith remains, although its theology, quote unquote, has become quite different. I don't have much time. So I wanted to look at Latour because I feel like he provides an aperture by which to understand why we are so allegiant to this idea of the separation of art, architecture, faith, and spirituality. The mode of looking and the mode that we experience here in architecture school goes something like this. Freed from religious bondage, the moderns could criticize the obscurantism of the old powers by revealing the material causality that those powers stimulated, even as they inverted those very phenomena in the artificial disenclosure of the laboratory. Latour is doing is he's looking and he's saying this idea that modernism has progressed in such a way that we no longer have to engage with the past because there have been epistemic ruptures that completely disallow a kind of sincere engagement with spirituality are actually not true. And it's a construct that has been created by what he calls the modern constitution. Really quickly, the way I looked at this was in the Greek theater. The Greek theater was actually a site of ritual and devotional practice to the god Dionysius. The way, however, the narration of the theater emerged through Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who was an architect and one of the early emerging archaeologists of his day in the 1800s, was through the excavation of the theater of Dionysius. So what he does here is he finds his theater, and then he proposes based on these few rocks that the oldest theater of Dionysius was actually a circle. And you can kind of see it right in there. He traces out these circles. And this is where the rocks are down here. When in fact he knew that, and so he creates this origin myth about the circle for the Greek theater. And he says that it came from this period of time in which circles were the essential place of Aeschylus and Sophocles, when he knew that the precedents were otherwise, that they were actually rectilinear and highly irregular. What his findings produce and what this idea communicates is this kind of obsession with formal logics, that it is more desirable to engage with a discourse based on form rather than engaging with a discourse that's looking at the social practices of a culture. I think what's interesting, in closing, I think what's interesting is that this picture by Caravaggio proposes a way forward for architecture, that architecture operating as the body of Christ in this photo, that it provides aperture to mystery, a mode of engagement with the unknown, rather than being a sarcastic kind of dialogue of symbols and form. If you go to many of the studios we have here, the kind of discussion you hear is about how are people entering and exiting the building. I was at a discussion about churches the other day, and there was absolutely no discussion whatsoever about the practice of worship or the phenomenon of worship and what does that mean within a culture, within our current context. All the discussion was based on form. Everything was based on like facade and how you entered and exit the building and the perception of a church in the current contemporary condition. So I would, so yeah, this is the kind of like the iconic provocation that I would leave for what does it look like to move forward in the discipline and education of architecture. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this event. I'm not an architect. I'm not a designer. I do know a little bit about Islamic art and philosophy, so I'm going to try to approach these issues from that perspective. Let's see. Okay. All art, I would argue, and it's kind of, I think, kind of a tautology or design, implies a cosmology, a philosophy of space and time and place therein, which in turn implies a metaphysics, a philosophy of what's real, what reality is, and how the different levels or aspects of reality are connected. Now, in the Islamic tradition, traditionally, this cosmology was not limited to just material space and time as we understand it today, but rather reality has multiple levels. Everything beneath the divine presence, the presence of God, all the way down to rocks, dirt. There are different levels of reality. I usually tell my students, kind of like the film Inception, it's a dream within a dream within a dream within a dream. And this is very important for understanding Islamic architecture and how it works. Because different metaphysics and different cosmologies will produce different kinds of art and architecture. And you can see this very clearly. If anyone's ever been to La Mezquita in Cordoba, you can see it's originally built as a mosque, and then they put a big Catholic, I don't even know, right in the middle, and looks like a spaceship that just landed out of nowhere. It's totally incongruous because it's coming from a different metaphysics and different cosmology. Or if you go to Cairo and you compare the old Mamluk-style architecture there with the giant high-rise buildings, they look like they're from two radically different worlds because they are from two radically different worlds. So Islamic art and architecture is based, I won't say based, can be summed up in the following hadith or saying of the Prophet, Allahu Jamil wa yuhibbul Jamal. God is beautiful and he loves beauty. Now, because of this conception and a related saying which is attributed to Plato, but is also extant in the Islamic tradition, beauty is the splendor of the true. Beauty is religiously important. Indifference to beauty from a traditional Islamic standpoint is tantamount to indifference to the divine, is tantamount to indifference to truth. And so I think it's no accident that modern civilizations and societies that show indifference to the sacred and indifference to truth have produced environments and buildings of unprecedented ugliness. I mean, look, if you go to an old Islamic city, find an ugly building, find one ugly building. I'll give you like all the money in my bank account, which is not much, but you can't find an ugly building. And so this is not a coincidence, I believe. Now, and you can see this, the same societies that produce lots of Islamophobic rhetoric will queue for hours to see the Alhambra or the Taj Mahal or sell out concerts of traditional Islamic music. So there's something about the truth, the reality, the inner dimensions of the Islamic tradition, Islamic spirituality that expresses itself most clearly in art in ways that's not accessible to people through theology or other things. So for this reason, I and some other people have called Islamic art and architecture kind of silent theology. Even as architecture is often called silent music, even in Islamic tradition. Music is number and time, architecture is number and space and geometry. But I should define my terms here. I teach philosophy, so it's very good to define terms. So Islamic art, I and others in the field define as art which emanates from the Quranic revelation, from the Islamic tradition. Its forms are informed by the forms of the Quranic revelation. It's distinct from Muslim religious art, which is any art that's used for religious devotion, right? So I could put up a nice cartoon picture of the Prophet or of the Kaaba in Mecca or something like that. That's not Islamic art necessarily, which is also different from Muslim art, which is any art that Muslims do, right? So Zaha Hadid makes interesting architecture, but it's not Islamic art. It's not based on the principles found in the Quran and the Islamic tradition. Okay, in the Islamic tradition, again, arts is often summed up in this term ihsan, which at once means moral and aesthetic excellence and beauty. And in another hadith, a saying of the Prophet, it's defined as worshiping God as if you see him. So what the Islamic arts do, in architecture in particular, is they allow us to see God. God is, of course, transcendent and can't be seen, but the arts allow us to worship God as if we see him, by making the invisible tangible, by making the divine present. And it does this through a symbolic science of correspondence and representation. In Quranic terms, it reproduces or makes present the malakut, or archetypes of things, which is the real reason for and some people call it the aniconic nature of Islamic art. I prefer to call it the hyper-iconic nature. Islamic art tends to take things, animals, plants, trees, and raise them to the Platonic geometric archetypes, which is a way of reintegrating them into divine unity. Now, these symbolic sciences are largely based on and accessed through traditions of esoteric spirituality, Sufism, and Islamic philosophy. And the master craftsmen and architects were usually, and the guilds were usually branches of Sufi orders, of mystical orders. And their structures and their design manuals were informed by works of Islamic philosophy. So a famous scholar of Islamic art, Titus Burckhardt, says, it's a great quote, "Just as a mental form, such as a dogma or doctrine, can be an adequate, albeit limited, reflection of a divine truth, so a sensible form can retrace a truth or reality which transcends both the plane of sensible forms and the plane of thought." And this is the function of this symbolic science, to make tangible, present, visible, understandable, these divine truths, which otherwise would be inaccessible to us. So the Islamic arts and architecture, they depict, they symbolize, they embody the metaphysical archetypes of the world of forms, integrating them back into the formless divine unity. Now, this process of making the divine visible is meant to nourish the soul. That's the function of Islamic art, and make tangible a kind of sakina, divine presence, peaceful presence in the world. And if any of you had the fortune to walk into a traditional Islamic mosque, you'll immediately feel there's a kind of presence there. Now, to get into the actual details of this symbolic science would require a whole other hour-and-a-half lecture, but I'll just go over a few of the principles here. So the first and most important, as being the first and most important thing in Islamic thought in general, is the principle of tawheed, or divine unity. Right, so if you see, this is the dome of the Hafeziye, where Hafez is buried, the famous poet in Iran. You see at the center there's total emptiness, blankness, transcendence. And then emanating from that, you see these different rays and patterns. And this is a common feature you'll see in almost all Islamic art. A center with radiation representing Tawheed, divine unity. And then the patterns, the things that emanate from it, are regular and rhythmic and patterned. Rhythm is the presence of oneness across multiplicity in time and space. So you'll find Tawheed anywhere you look in any Islamic art around the world. Also important in Islamic art, this is the Mezquita in Cordoba, is the notion of faqr, or emptiness. So actually, even if we go back to this, if the world is conceptualized as fullness, then the divine, the transcendent, will be conceptualized as emptiness. If the divine is conceptualized as fullness, the world will be conceptualized as emptiness. So when you walk into a mosque, this is another example of Tawheed from a mosque in Iran, in Yazd. If you walk into a mosque such as the Qutubiyya in Marrakesh, you're confronted by a great emptiness. There's nothing on the floors, no chairs, no nothing, and you feel this vast expanse. And you feel, in a certain sense, you experience something of your nothingness before the divine presence. It's a mosque in Marrakesh as well too. And this is in Lutfullah Mosque in Isfahan. And here you see the openness. You see kind of fullness, and when you enter into the main part of the mosque, there's this great big openness, and you see the emptiness. So there's this dynamic between fullness and emptiness there as well. It's the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. Again, this vast emptiness, Fakr, as it's called. Now, homes and mosques are understood and constructed as kind of microcosms. So anything you can do in a mosque, you can do in your home. And according to Islamic law, you can get married, you can pray. Anything you do in a mosque, you can recite Quran. And the homes and palaces and mosques were constructed as kind of microcosms. And the very structures there come from Quranic descriptions of the cosmos, descriptions in hadith of the cosmos. A lot of these mosque and palace complexes come from descriptions of things on the Day of Judgment. But one of the most common things that you'll see is you'll have a circular dome representing the heavens on top of an octagonal base. The octagonal base represents the divine throne, which is the boundary between the formal and the superformal world, between the divine and creation. There's also a verse in the Quran that says 8 angels hold the throne. So usually you'll find octagonal things on the throne, and then a square base representing the earth, terrestriality. The Qubat al-Sakhra, one of the great masterpieces of Islamic architecture, was built within the 1st century of Islam. And here, interesting, you actually start with an octagonal base because it's the place where the Prophet ascended into heaven. So you start at the divine throne and just go up. Now, Islamic cities were also constructed as a kind of microcosm, often with, at their heart, a mosque or a saint's tomb. And then you had different parts of the city corresponding to different body parts. The interior of homes, again, feature many. I don't have time to go into the different things, but the interior of traditional Islamic homes also featured many of the same design features and microcosmic elements. Now, the last thing I want to end on, so traditional Moroccan homes and traditional homes in the Islamic world in general are generally square and inward facing. And at the center, there's usually a fountain, usually an 8-pointed fountain. So there's a hadith saying the Prophet that the heart of the believer is the throne of the All-Merciful. So you see the divine throne there at the heart of the house. And they're usually rather plain outwardly and very decorated inwardly, indicating that they're supposed to represent kind of the ideal human being. The ideal human being is inwardly dynamic, is focused on the spiritual, and the fountain of life comes from the heart. Okay, so I'd like to conclude just by saying design is not neutral. Design always assumes cosmology, always assumes a metaphysics. And so the question is not really can design and religion coexist, but what religion is informing your design? Thank you.
This guy. Is that up there?
It's on.
Good. Okay. Good morning, all. I'm going to have to be very quick, so I apologize for the haste. Taking inspiration from Christian's doubting Thomas, could someone please relate to my wife that I didn't touch the donuts, which she will immediately suggest is apocryphal. So, look, I'm not going to talk about space or architecture as such. I'm going to talk about the Ivri, the Jewish people, this Jewish person in his encounter with academia and the discipline per se. Ivri, and you can help me on this, but etymologically comes to the idea of crossing over in some way. So I'm going to talk about a number of people who had to make that crossing and what happened along the way. The story I'm going to tell is very familiar, but it must be told again and again and again. And I'm putting up, this is a recent text of mine, and the word on accidents, which has to do with my models of history, is going to come up in the very last slide in what I suspect will be to an alarming way, and we'll get there soon enough. And if you have to go on Amazon during the course of my talk to buy this book, I won't feel amiss if you start Googling. Okay. Look, this is where it begins. My formation begins. I was an undergrad for a reason time of computers. You had to fumble through the card catalog. I wasn't even clear how this character's name was spelled. But you see the Modern System for Arts by Chris Steller from the journal Journalistic Ideas. Here's Alderman Library, the kind of scene of the initial trauma. I ciphered my way through it and retrieved this text and photocopied it. And one of the first things I noticed, I must have been 17 or 18 at the time, that there was this curious disjunction spatially between the text, which I've demarcated above, and the footnotes, which loomed below. And as life went along, I descended from the text to the subtext to the footnotes, and now I'm on some kind of illuminated discursive basement. But this relationship was made clear to me somewhat later on by another one of my mentors when I was at Princeton. This is Tony Grafton, as you can see, where he described the architecture of the book itself, the mise en page, the footnote. He says, "Oh." And just here to give this the architecture, structural quality of books themselves. So I'm a bibliophile. So try to find out when and why historians adopted their distinctively modern form of narrative architecture. And On Accident has to do entirely with narrative architectures. To learn who first erected this curious arcade, its ornate piano nobile, and its open bottom floor, the footnotes that offer glimpses of so many alluring wares. Lovely and instructive. And when I looked at this text finally, overcome by my initial shock, and I was led into this idea of elementary disciplines, how it is we have the system of modern arts, why we speak of poetry, painting, and philosophy, and all these other things. I was cognizant years later of how I became disciplined and the discipline I entered. So in the most general terms, this is what I'm talking about. And this is one very beautiful representation of it from Boethius's Constellations of Philosophy. And here we see philosophy presenting the 7 liberal arts to Boethius. And they're all identified here. You can see grammar, rhetoric, logic, the trivium, music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy, the quadrivium, and how they were parceled out and where they fit in this thing called the curriculum, as you see here. The curricula is the basis of what we learn in schools today, or what we are very casually throwing out in our assassination of the canon. But we can get to that. And for Boethius, you have the pathos of knowledge, the acquisition. Where's my colleague? But the very beauty of things in the world, conveyed through philosophy. And here, a sense of Boethius's own exile, of being cast out, why he required this consolation. And this is the only quote I'll read to you. He says, "When I saw you weeping in your grief, I know at once that you were wretchedly banished." And what I'll talk about in a moment is banishment, also self-banishment. But how remote was that banishment that I should not have known if your speech had not told me, but how far from your homeland you have strayed. Okay? And if you are like me and academia has become a second foreign, tenuous, fickle, ambiguous, treacherous homeland, especially as an overweight, middle-aged Jewish man, cisgendered, these terms resonate. So strayed, not driven. It wasn't driven, they found their way. I say, or if you prefer to be thought of as driven, then how far you have driven yourself. You're kidding. Okay. For in your case, it would never have probably been possible for anyone else to do this. You must remember what your native country is. So let's go back to the native country. Let's go back to these arts who are here as incarcerated with Boethius. And I'll talk about my own Misbucher, and here this splendid painting by Nicole Eisman. You can see at the Jewish Museum on Fifth Avenue, and my people and how they appeared to me at a somewhat later date in my academic career. Recently, I came back to Chris Steller's text for a variety of reasons, and it appeared to me very differently now that I've been thoroughly disciplined by the field. And the names, the characters in the text resonated to me in a new way. And since I'm very short on time, I'll do this very quickly because you'll get the picture, what I'm trying to do here. So here's Paul Oscar Christeller, the author of the text, and I'll read with you. In the field of Renaissance study, his student Jane Henkins observed, he was the last of the great German Jewish refugees, who, and that's a very loaded, complicated sentence, who came to the United States in the 1930s and really made their marks on American culture and American life, which is saying, to a large extent, American academic life is the product of this Jewish imagination. I know that's a ludicrous claim. I'll qualify it later. But it's a complicated family history, as if you've ever sat at a Seder, you know. Christella's mother, Alice, and adopted father, Heinrich, remained in Berlin, so he left. And they were eventually deported to Eisenstadt, et cetera, And of the 1,000 deportees from their city, Alice and Heinrich were among the 941 who were murdered. Then if we go down on the list, on the marquee, we go from Christella to here dedicated to Hans Tietze on his 70th birthday. Here's to see an image by Oscar Paschke of Tietze and his wife. Hans Tietze's biography plays itself out in the text. He was born in Prague, the son of Siegfried Tausig and August Paul. When Hans was 13, he fell in Vienna and converted to Protestantism. And they changed their name. Okay, the Ivri changed their name as a people, but he changed their name to Tietze, and he declared himself religiously unaffiliated. He's unmoored in the world. And in 1933, he published Jews in Vienna, Historical Economics Culture, perhaps as a post hoc exercise in Jewish identity deformation, or coming to terms with his own forlorn but also surrendered identity. And then if we go further down in the text, in this little zone between the text and the footnotes, he gets into his indebtedness, his inheritance, his heritage, and you can go through this list of people, and it becomes a veritable gallery of these transitional characters I'm talking about. Julius Hell, the sainted Aaron Panofsky, Meyer Shapiro, who changed his name, as you see at Ellis Island. And here, they landed, many of them, Shapiro in Columbia, the others in Princeton, but here in particular, Panofsky, who was my intellectual lodestar as an undergrad. But here you see backhanded gifts of Hitler to America per Rensselaer W. Lee, who was quoted there earlier, the author of a book on Mimesis, which is a masterpiece. The phrase is attributed to Lee's President Charles Murray, who was instrumental in finding Panofsky an institutional home, a home away, a home itself, a safe place, a refuge, a haven, an Eden, a grove of academe. The Institute of Advanced Study, which itself was endowed by Abraham Flexner, the Bronte Flexner, by Bamberger family, which is to say a Jewish department store fortune. This is how one thing begets another. The transition from that urban type to the suburban is the talk for another day, for someone else to give. But you know, if you want department stores, then you get John von Neumann, who was working at the Institute, this furry-footed fellow who was working at the Institute, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These Jews abroad who had lost their footing in the world. Finally, architecture and the disciplining itself, and this is where I'm getting to my little denouement. If you work through Christeller's text of how architecture itself became an art, a discipline, what have you, he said it began with the mechanical arts articulated by U of St. Victor in his pedagogic texts, his Didascalicon, which is a fabulous book, and he was included along with armatura, as you see. It's one of the mechanical arts, subordinate arts. Armatura, the art of arms. And I just show this in terms of the agony in our own field. Here's Boethius leaning on his podium to speak. A podium like this, a support that appears to buttress him, whereas the man of armor, it appears like a sword, leads into the air and he's ready to deliver harm onto all who come near. And the role of armor, or how we gather and marshal force or meaning in this world. And here from all the students in the room know Ville de Duc's text, but here on the history of armor. And he says, infantry is valuable only if it is subject to severe discipline. And that's what happens in schools. We are disciplined. But the vision of what's going on in college campuses today, on my former college campus, et cetera. And finally, because I know I'm out of time, I'm okay? I'm going very quickly. When Christeller gets to the question of architecture itself. So it's architecture as well as the various branches of sculpture and painting are listed along with several arts and crafts as divisions of armatura, and thus occupy a quite subordinate place even among the mechanical arts. And remember, the bonistic or the mechanical arts are already below the liberal arts, and so we're getting down in the basement. But here's a footnote. This is what helps. For the position of the architect in particular, position is like, a podium, it's a place, standing in the world. C. N. Pevsner, or as the English call him, Nicky P. Nicholas Pevsner, the term architect in Middle Ages in the journal Speculum. So let's look at Nicholas Pevsner. Here he is. And here's the term, here's the essay. The term architect, as if it were a term of abuse. Okay. Pevsner is a very tricky character. As you see, I'm just repeating this kind of problematic portraits. And here, Pevsner was a logorrhea. He wrote endlessly. He wrote more than an afternoon than I've written in my life, and I can probably demonstrate that bibliometrically. But in any case, Pevsner was raised in Leipzig by Russian Jewish parents, Hillel Pevsner, later Hugo Pevsner, and Anna Perelman. At age of 19, Pevsner converted to Protestantism, another again. And if you look at the prosopography of the period, this isn't necessarily an outstanding feature. It has to do, as you see, with the possibility for professional advancement. But he later explained, done for me to become a normal German. Normal. And I emphasize that because if you're interested in accidents, as I am, then the antonym to accidents is the norm, or the rule, the regular, the law. A complex exercise in self-discipline. I shall be straight, I shall be normal, I shall be German, I shall not be Jewish. Abraham Ivory, Abraham the Jew, that I will not be. Pevsner's expressed support for broad components of National Socialism, expressed broad support for broad components of National Socialism, even after his immigration to England in 1933, where, by the way, he was, two more slides, he was put in a account for aliens in England. Now, interestingly enough, if you want to look at the canonical expression of the, as it says here, the Englishness of English art post-war, it is not given by Summerson or whomever else you want. It's given by Nicholas Pevsner in what was originally the Reich lecture on BBC, the Englishness of English art. And Panofsky had his turn on this. He wrote about the ideological antecedents of the Rolls-Royce grill, et cetera, et cetera. But this is this principal statement of what it means to be English. And this guy, by the way, lives by the dictum, think Yiddish, dress British. But I don't dress so British because I'm kind of shaped like a Yiddish. Okay, so here's the problem. He writes this book, and he says, and I'll read it quickly, because I know I'm out of time. Here's my sole intention to answer this question, which might well be asked: why I should have set myself up as a judge of English qualities in English art, being neither English born nor English bred, birth, discipline, formation. He, by the way, wanted to be a normal German. Having entered England only at the age of 28, he lived in the country not longer than 20 years. 20 years, admittedly, not long enough to learn about and to understand the country, et cetera, et cetera. And here, you can see the problems of his self-identity. As for my own professional career, his discipline, I had worked in Saxon Baroque architecture in Leipzig and Dresden, and then Italian Baroque painting before I reached England. Fine. This is where it gets very tricky. Immediately after the war, I went back to it, and this time with a view of making a book of it. It was then that I came across the only existing book on the subject. Really? The only existing book on English architecture by a Viennese art historian, Dagobert Frey, in his English Invest in the Bildungskunst, the English character reflected in English art, which was published in the middle of the war, 1942, yet is absolutely free from any hostile remarks, let alone any German bias. Here's Dagobert Frey. Letter to the editor, where we do so much of our work these days. Here from Richard Howard, if any of you have seen the movie book in the Monuments Man, he was the chief monuments man, in a professional journal, a vehicle, organ of the discipline. Here in the translation of Dagobert Frey's work, here exposing him as it were. Frey, immediately upon conquest of Poland by Germany, left his position in Breslau and went to Poland to collaborate with the German occupation forces. He was responsible, according to official reports, for looting of the art treasures in Poland, particularly in Krakow and Warsaw. He collaborated with Gestapo in Warsaw on the confiscation of Polish collections with a technical expert. He was involved in the looting, destruction of the Palace of Warsaw, and the Weizstas altar, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is his group. It is sad that so fine and distinguished a scholar should have become so deeply involved in affairs of this sort. Okay, here's our expert in English art. Curious though, if you go back to that title page, and again, I'm working very quickly, Pesner, and if you go to England, yeah, I'm done. This is the last slide. In Pesner, if you go to England, you want to look at anything, you can look at Pesner Guide. He's talking about his own confused self, his own Englishness, what have you. And his original study of Baroque in Leipzig and Dresden, his subsequent kind of acculturation in England, and anticipating this new use he'll have for Frey's book, he says, stimulated by this accidental demonstration of national qualities. Really? Was it by accident that Nicholas Pesner ended up in England? That he gave up his essential self, he had an acquired self, that this was happening in the middle of 1942? By this accidental demonstration of opposite national qualities, I began to collect materials and subject book. I would decide what was Englishness and English art. So we can talk about this. I'll just end by saying this, that the reason I went back to Chris Steller's text, because a couple of years ago, with the assistance of Anthony Grafton, who I showed you earlier, I published this piece in the Journal of the History of Ideas, which had been my very long-standing academic ambition to publish in the same place where Chris Steller had published his text, and which was my introduction into academia. The text, by the way, had to do with John Elder's accusation that Vitruvius stole his notion of classical architecture from the Mosaic account, and it was glorious. But I was then finally disciplined, because if you go to JSTOR to get this article, you of course must accept their terms and conditions, which is what happens when you get deep into academia. So look, I'm going to end there. I thank you for your patience, and I'll step down. Yeah.
So I feel like before I begin, I just have to anticipate some of the conversation that I'm looking forward to at the end by saying I've always understood the history of art discipline. Where's Ed? Did he go out? The history of art, the art history as a discipline in the United States is that of Jewish professors teaching Catholic art to Protestant students. And I think that doesn't actually fit anymore. So we can kind of talk about what maybe the next iteration of that is. Okay, so first I have to thank the organizers for a really great program. Kudos to you guys. So I want to also, how's the sound? Okay, yeah. I want to also say I'm not an architect. I'm a literary studies scholar. And my entry into these questions comes from a book I wrote called Space and Place in Jewish Studies. So a lot of what I'm going to be saying, this morning is drawn from that work. I've always been interested in the relation between space and memory. And so when, sort of building on what we have learned from people like Lefebvre and Desserteau and the spatial turn, my interest in space can be sort of broken down into three different categories. First, the aesthetic and literary depiction of space. That was really my point of departure as a scholar of literary studies. But then also two other categories that Lefebvre speaks about. The second is the social experience of space, right? Space as a lived human experience. And then the third, space as a kind of a built space, right? Everything else, basically, I think everything that goes on in this building. And so the examples that I will speak about today are sort of really drawing on those last two categories, right? Built space and space as a lived experience. So first of all, any discussion of space within Jewish cultures, within the Judaic tradition, I think has to begin with this kind of fundamental notion that space is related to something called the sacred or the divine. So the word for place in Hebrew, the ordinary word for place in Hebrew is makom. And this is, a word that you will use like if you're looking for a place to park, or you're looking for a seat in a theater. In other words, it's an ordinary term, but it also, within Judaic tradition, is a kind of a synonym or a nickname for God. I'm going to say that again because it's kind of important. It's a synonym or a nickname for God. And it derives from rabbinic readings from antiquity of even older biblical texts about encounters with the divine. So in the early biblical texts, in the Hebrew Bible, whenever, someone is kind of wandering around outside and encounters God, that place is called makom. And again, it's kind of an ordinary term, but it's the encounter between a human being and God that creates this sense of sacredness and divinity and transcendence. And so in the rabbinic tradition, later, the rabbis writing in antiquity will sort of offer their drash or their interpretation of Genesis, of those biblical texts. And they'll say, why is the Blessed One, why is God called makom? Why is he called place? Because he is the place of the world. So we can spend a lot of time just talking about this, but what I really want you to take away is just this notion of this kind of intertwined sense of place and sacredness from the get-go. And so we might ask, how does this kind of twinning of space and sacredness within Judaic tradition, how does this shape Jewish spaces and Jewish spatial practices? So I'll present a few examples here. And basically, what I want you to focus on is this notion of mobility and impermanence, right? And so we see here from the very beginning, this is an imagined drawing, obviously, right? The biblical Ark of the Covenant, a place that was created by the Israelites as they moved through the desert to kind of mark sacredness and an encounter with God. But the important thing here is not so much that they built it, and there are within these biblical texts, a lot of kind of interesting architectural instructions and sort of design-oriented instructions. I think the important piece is that it was mobile. In other words, they would build it and then they would take it apart and then they would move with it. So this mobility and this impermanence becomes a kind of a central piece of Jewish spatial practices. So, for example, again, a few other examples, that will sort of emblematize this mobility. The sukkah, which is a hut that is created on the holiday of Sukkot, the Feast of the Tabernacles. It happens in conjunction with the harvest, usually around the New Year, sort of after the summer, September, October in this country. From the commandment in the book of Leviticus, you shall live in booths 7 days, so that future generations may know that I made you wander in the desert. So again, there are design instructions for this. You can see them there. Does this work? There it is. You can see them there. This is kind of a whole industry here. But, the important thing is that it is temporary, right? It's something that is created and designed, usually with sort of input from family and neighbors and the community. This is actually the Chabad Sukkah in Venice. I love this image, right? Because it kind of really emblematizes the mobility and the impermanence that you see in these constructions. And all of these go up once a year and then they come down again. Perhaps the rabbinic spatial practice par excellence that really gets to this idea of something that is mobile and impermanent is the notion of the rabbinic eruv. Okay, so eruv simply means enclosure. And if you've been here and you're sort of wondering like, well, why haven't I seen it? I live here. So it's sort of important for people who need it. If you are an observant Jew and you need to do certain things on the Sabbath, certain practices, you may do it within this border that is circumscribed by the eruv. But it's usually, like a kind of a string. This is from New York. Sometimes they'll use natural boundaries like the river. And again, it's important to remember, again, that these practices, these spatial practices were come from a historical moment when Jews lived as a colonial minority within the Roman Empire. So they're about kind of consecrating space for a minority population within a larger mixed setting. And another example, the mezuzah, which is a small container with a scroll with words of certain liturgical text that is placed on the home of a house and will make it Jewish, right? And this is also something that you can take down and bring with you to the next place that you live. But both the eruv and the mezuzah, in addition to their kind of impermanence, you could see how they're sort of vernacular practices that are made to consecrate a space within an expressly mixed community. How much time do I have? 4 minutes. Oh, excellent. All right, so now moving away from the sort of built space, impermanent built space, to this other notion of, spaces sort of lived social experience. Just a few examples here. A man reading a page of the Talmud on the New York subway. This is not something that I've ever seen, by the way, and I take the subway pretty frequently, but it kind of begs the question, like, what kind of book do you have to be reading on the subway in order for it to be considered Jewish space? I'm not sure. Bagels and lox, etc. So reading, eating, listening, other kinds of practices done either on your own or with somebody else that might create a space that is considered Jewish in some respects. And so the whole question of like the relation between sacred and secular here, I think, is very interesting. My colleague at NYU, Barbara Kirschenbach-Limbutt, has used the term kitchen Judaism to describe, sort of a more anthropological term to describe these less overtly religious, liturgical spaces, but that are nonetheless kind of tagged as Jewish in some sense. And then finally, I would say that all of these practices, the sukkah, the mezuzah, the eruv, all of the kind of cultural, anthropological ways of thinking about space are expressly diasporic practices. They are practices that are, attached to a community that has felt itself either vulnerable or on the move in some respect, and are often connected to specific languages that are spoken by Jewish communities all over the world and questions of memory. So I wanted to close with two specific examples. When I was invited to come speak today, I tried to think of ways in which this notion of makom and the kind of the impermanence or the elevation or the privileging of something that could seem kind of flimsy or mobile would actually be a virtue in the design world. So that's the first one is this. This is from the Center for Jewish Life at Johns Hopkins. I just happened to be down there a couple of weeks ago looking at it with my daughter. And this is a prayer space. And so you can see here, this is the Ark, and the Torah is kept back there. This is called a mechitza, right? It's a divider. Perhaps the last people who used this space, the men prayed on one side and the women prayed on the other side. But that is something that could, in an Orthodox setting, right? But that is something that could be easily moved. And I was told, in fact, that the room is used for all kinds of things, right? It's used for study sessions. It's used for things that are not expressly related to prayer. So this whole notion of something that's multi-purpose, something that can kind of work in different settings in different ways, seemed to me related to this idea, to the notion of makom. And finally, Sukkah City, which is an event that happens in Washington Square and Greenwich Village in New York City every year. And you see, anybody ever been to Sukkah City? Just out of curiosity. No, Ben, you never went. Oh, there you go. Some New Yorkers in the room, right? So these are, I'm imagining I'm just guessing that there's a pretty decent representation from the GSD at Sukkah City, right? So they're sort of designers and architects who create different forms. Again, it coincides with the holiday of Sukkot, but they're interested in issues of sustainability and green design. So this was another area where I thought maybe there was some sort of connection between Judaic notions of makom, Judaic notions of space, and contemporary design. Thank you.
Now we're going to move the chairs so that we can begin with the panels and questions.